And thank you everybody for coming in for another Eye on Africa. Greetings, and my name is Awasar. I am Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center. And we're very happy today to have Professor Fikeni as our guest speaker. And I'm gonna let my colleague, Dr. Damaris Choti, the privilege of introducing Professor Fikeni. And I want to thank Damaris for facilitating this, for helping us to coordinate to have Professor Fikeni with us today to share some thoughts. So thank you again, Damaris, and I will let you introduce our guest.
Thank you so much, Awa, for that introduction. I really have a great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, our speaker today for Eye on Africa. I've had a privilege of working closely with Dr. Fikeni in my role as the coordinator of student and alumni programs for the African Studies Center. It's been really wonderful. And Professor Fikeni is the president of the African Alumni and Friends Network that is hosted here at the African Studies Center. So Dr. Fikeni has a long profile or bio, but in brief, Somadoda Fikeni is a public figure who has held various leadership roles in the public sector organizations and as a scholar or public intellectual who has influenced public discourse, institution building, and public policies. He is currently the chairperson of the Public Service Commission of South Africa, as well as the chairperson of the Indlulamithi South Africa Scenarios Board of Trustees. He is also a visiting scholar at the Nelson Mandela University and the president of the Michigan State University African Alumni Network. I already mentioned that. Professor Fikeni's areas of specialization and interest are political science, public policy analysis and development, history, political economy, and heritage. His main professional work has been and continues to be in the public policy development, higher education, and heritage sector. He has chaired a number of boards and councils and participated in establishment and repositioning organizations. He has received several honors and awards in South Africa and abroad, and one of these is the honorary chieftaincy that was bestowed on him in Ghana. He is a community development activist and has initiated a number of community development and charity organizations to mobilize resources for assistance of the poor and the disadvantaged. As a student and a youth, he was involved in anti-apartheid struggle and got detained on numerous occasions for his activism. Dr. Fikeni, we're pleased to welcome you, and his topic of our presentation today is Dilemmas and Opportunities for Africa, Navigating Emergency of a New World Order in a Volatile and Polarized World. I hand this over to you, Dr. Fikeni. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much to you, Dr. Choti Damaris. I think there's a bit of a time lag there. Can I come in now?
Yes, please. You're welcome to begin.
Yes. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts on a topic that is still evolving, and I'm working on it. And I would have loved to flight a slide presentation, but unfortunately, there was a memorial service that at the last minute we were asked to attend of another great African scholar, Professor Shadrach Guto, who passed away a few days ago. Originally from Kenya, but he became a South African citizen. So I'll just speak to my notes, and once I've finished preparing the paper, I will be able to share it as well. The focus here is trying to locate Africa within this very fast changing global system. And out of this, Africa facing some of the opportunities, some of the dilemmas, as well as challenges in the choices that it has to make. And that in itself, I actually start by also reflecting towards the end on the African agency, because in the past epochs, Africa and its agency was often muted or it was marginal. But what I'm trying to play with here is the fact that Africa remains marginal in the global system in terms of its power, influence, in terms of the economic share. But at the same time, it is central when we look at the scramble for Africa, precisely because of its resources for the contending superpowers or global powers, as well as the projected demographic dividends, whatever comes out of that in the end. But the fact that Africa has a youthful population, a growing middle class, which is likely to become one of the largest consuming blocks in terms of any products that are presented. That has made Africa central, but at the same time, Africa remains marginal. So that is the dichotomy or the paradox of the African continent. I, at some point, say when you look at the map of Africa, you look at a map that looks more like a question mark. And that question mark, indeed, in a symbolic manner, has a number of questions that remain unanswered. But I will attempt to reflect on some of those issues. But what we are witnessing at the moment, it's what I call an epoch-changing moment or defining moment, whatever that will be once it has emerged. But it is quite clear that at this moment, we are on one threshold of a number of changes that will reconfigure the global system. That reconfiguration, in part, is caused by the crisis in the current global system, which has not been able to resolve a range of issues that I will come to very soon. What are these mega trends? What are these major forces that are at play that we must locate the discourse or the discussion on these changings in the global system? The first one are the geopolitical tensions. And these are mainly informed by the contestation between the US and the Western Bloc, which is trying to preserve its dominance in the global system. At the same time, you do have a fast emerging Chinese power bloc, as well as other regional players, some emerging to the status of being global players, such as India. Those are trying to challenge the existing, unipolar system. I would say it's unipolar. I do know that many scholars have debated this and said it's multipolar, but my view after the assessment of literature is that in the post-Cold War period, from the 90s onwards, we've had a largely unipolar system with different regional blocks or different power blocks which were there, but not on a substantial scale. And it is the first time now in the 21st century, with the rise of China, with the rise of other powers such as India, that you're beginning to feel that the Western dominance in that sense is being challenged. So the tensions you see and inflection points around the world, whether it is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war, therefore, in Ukraine, you find that it turns out to be a proxy war in terms of these tensions between the West and the East, or not necessarily the East in a traditional sense of the Cold War, as well as the South, because China is a major force there. So you do have the current tensions which are at a boiling point in the Middle East, especially Israel and Gaza, or Israel and the Palestinian occupied territories. Those two become a proxy of some of these geopolitical tensions. Of course, you could mention the ones in Asia, especially around the Taiwan matter, the Koreas, as well as some of the disputed islands around the Philippines. So those are some of the geopolitical tensions that are playing out, but they often feed to this contestation between the two power blocks, one trying to preserve its dominance and one trying to encroach into the space which was often preserved for the Western-dominated system. The second one is your technological changes and innovations, which are shaping the global system, which are being used as tools of transaction, tools of war, even the cyber war, and several other things which are coming to the fore. And these have now evolved even to the level of what impact artificial intelligence, deep learning, automated machines could be. But we are not yet there, as the big players are wrestling over these with the big corporations. Then the other major force, which is a key driver, is your climate change, the environmental crisis, which has triggered the issue of just transition, where people are beginning to look at the alternative sources of power or energy. And that in itself, I'll come back to that point, has implications for the African continent. And of course, lastly, the issue of growing inequality, poverty, unemployment is one of those, major driving forces which are beginning to challenge the global system, because many of these crises that we see are an indication of a global system that has not been able to respond in any creative or imaginative manner to the challenges of our time. And at times it has been dependent on the post-Second World War arrangements, whether it's migration policies or development finance institutions like your Bretton Woods institutions. They have tended to mirror that period, not recognizing the changes and the shifts. That's why you're beginning to see some of the challenges and the strains in the system. Never mind that, according to Oxfam and several other studies, in the last 20 years, it is your top 1% that has been growing faster, whereas other regions have been regressing in that sense. Of course, Africa is affected in a particular way by some or all of these particular changes in the global system. And I will reflect on that at some point. Maybe taking one step back so that we can contextualize the current developments. Africa has been witnessing successive epochs in which it has been marginal, but at the same time central. So this issue of marginality and centrality is a dominant theme, because as you will see in the previous epochs, though Africa was seen as marginal, but it was seen as a strategic central focal point. Hence, the scramble for Africa has been with us for more than 500 years. The first period was the era of slave trade, which had a great influence on the global system then, with Africa seen as the supplier of labor. Hence, slaves were largely extracted from the African continent more than many other places. And this in itself, the commodification of African labor, was the dominant feature, especially for the New World, whether South or Latin America and even Europe to that extent. So this in itself is an epoch in which Africa was being marginalized, but its labor force, its personnel was seen as central in terms of a raw material instead of human beings. The second one was the era, the colonial era, especially during that defining moment of the Berlin Congress, which partitioned Africa. Yes, some parts of Africa were already colonies, but it simply defined and formalized and institutionalized this colonial arrangement. So this era again, you see Africa being seen as a commodity, but it is not on the table, but it was being discussed in the Berlin Congress. In each one of these epochs, where Africa is not on the table, it ends up being on the menu and therefore being for consumption. We see the same period when a new epoch in the post-Second World War and during the Cold War period, where the scramble for Africa as a geopolitical, tussle between the East and the West was taking place. Again, during this period, even though some of the African countries were now gaining independence, they were still very much pulled and pushed around as proxies for the big power battles. And that in itself, again, was a defining feature. And that global order of the post-Second World War would have serious implications for Africa's development, because institutions designed then, such as World Bank, such as your World Trade Organization, all those have massive implications on Africa, and yet Africa was not there on the table, save for one or two countries which were still there. Their influence was negligible. So now we see the post-Cold War period in the early 90s or late 80s. That period too, Africa was to become an object, but largely this time the influence was predominantly Western influence, with very little, if any, and a receding influence from what used to be the Soviet Union, which now had fragmented into different republics. But now the focal point is the 21st century, where we are, especially as we enter the third decade of the 21st century, because you can sense that at this moment, tensions are clearly defined and they are rising. Demands which are pushed by the key trends that I've spoken to are becoming more intense, and they're forcing the global system to come up with answers. So that in itself, it's the space where Africa finds itself caught up. But now I want to refer quickly to some of what I call Africa's recent marginalization traumas, which have shaped the political psychology of African leaders, as some of their voices are now gaining some traction. The first one, during the global pandemic that is unprecedented in our lifetime, COVID-19, the one continent that seemed to be left behind in the main when the world and humanity was facing this existential crisis was Africa. That's where we saw vaccine nationalism. That's where we saw vaccine apartheid, as the South was beginning to interpret that. Where you see well-advanced countries, pharmaceutical industries, stockpiling more than what their countries would need, when Africa barely had anything. And one of those, when African countries like South Africa, like Egypt, like Nigeria, like Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, were requesting, and Ghana, their the lifting of some of the rights so that it can be possible for them to produce locally some of these drugs? The answer was a resounding no. That's when they felt this marginalization trauma, where they were hoping for global solidarity to come together at the point of this existential crisis. And that is well articulated by leaders now who have been reminding Western leaders to say, we faced this crisis, we thought we would stand together, but there was no response on your side. There was stockpiling, there was vaccine nationalism. And during that period, they then felt they had gone back to being marginals. Again, during the same COVID-19 period, in China and in other places, there seemed to be the racial attitude and the discrimination of Africans, even though the disease itself had not originated from the continent. There are many instances in some of the Chinese malls, in some of the places where people were barring Africans from coming in. That in itself resuscitating again that trauma of racism. And this coincides with a time when the killing, of a Black man in the US had triggered the Black Lives Matter across the world. And therefore the issue of identity had come to the fore. And that in itself is one of those things that is refusing to go away, the issue of identity, especially the prejudice against Africans. While still on that issue of identity and prejudice, when Russia invaded Ukraine and they were trying to rescue people out of the war zone, again, it appeared as though some of the countries like Poland were not ready to receive Africans. They rather prioritized their own. And those are some of the current traumas that were lifted to the surface given the history of the continent. Of course, you do have the issue of the climate crisis, which is hitting Africa in the hardest possible way, especially in the Sahel region, which would be associated with some of the tensions which are rising there and the search for scarce resources. The climate crisis has led to various efforts in the climate conferences to come up with solutions. And among those solutions of reducing carbon emission, of transitioning from the consumption of the carbon factor or the energy that is generating using the fossil fuels. There has been a talk of just transition. And that in itself, Africa saying it has not been the major emitter, but at the same time, the burden of transition is beginning to pose some of the challenges. The conditionality of the loans given to the Africans, as well as the fact that when they talk of just transition, Africans have just realized now that the stringent timelines, deadlines, and conditions imposed on them. When Ukraine was invaded and Russian oil and gas supply to Western Europe became a factor and they were looking for alternative sources of energy supply, we see the same countries, yes, understandably facing existential crisis, renewing and resuscitating their coal-fired power plants. At the same time, reminding African countries, including those which are coal producing, to say you dare not touch that coal. Living in South Africa, I've seen this graphic example along Richards Bay, where you have the coal-rich region, where trucks line up to 15 kilometers. You'll calculate how many miles those would be, to take coal, the premium coal, to the port. And where is this coal going? Primarily to Europe. And again, the same countries would be saying, stick to your strict deadlines and targets in terms of alternative energy sources, even though this might present dilemmas in terms of poverty, in terms of unemployment, in terms of industrialization or deindustrialization. So those are some of the current traumas that have colored this period. The other one, of course, is the mishandling of the migration crisis, especially across the Mediterranean, when many African countries had wanted some consultation, some discussion, and an arrangement. You have heard again the particular treatment of the migrants from Africa. Of course, the situation in Haiti, in the Caribbean islands, whilst it is part of the general problem of Latin America and the migration crisis, that in itself has been one of the recent traumas. And these traumas are the ones that are now raising some concerns amongst the African leaders. And some are beginning to even lose faith in some of the standards, as well as, the democratic system itself, the party system that is being put in place, that was put in place in the wave of democratization in the 1990s. It is for that reason that you begin to see some regimes which again are caught up in a proxy of war between the West, between the West and Russia, between the West and China, whether it's investments or some of the tensions that you have seen in West Africa, where one regime after the other is being toppled, Niger, Mali, Gabon, and so forth. So again, in this case, you begin to see the proxy wars between the major powers. And you also see the stakes being very high precisely because of the search for alternative resources such as gas, such as oil, and of course, the centrality of Africa comes in here precisely because some of the strategic minerals for your smartphones, for your alternative energy, even uranium and so forth, are to be found in the continent, the ones at least which are not under the strict control, as well as the reserves which are there. And that is the reason why many countries, especially regional and global powers, have had a series of summits with Africa. And some of these are part of the geopolitical configuration. US has had its Africa summit. Currently today, there are AGOA negotiations between the US and Africa, about 35 countries, is taking place here in Johannesburg, precisely because the issues of trade and fair trade or access to markets has become a big thing. Hence, these negotiations are taking place. China has had several Africa-focused summits. Japan has done the same. European Union has done the same. Britain, having broken away from the European Union, has been trying to do the same. Turkey seemingly is also entering this, Russia and so forth. So you can begin to see the scramble for Africa. But this time around, unlike the previous periods, that scramble is being met with some initiatives from the continent, which brings in the factor of agency of Africa itself, that it is not just being acted upon as a helpless continent. That agency we saw when Thabo Mbeki talked of the 21st century being the African century, Of course, this was aspirational. I do know that when we face this crisis, we tend to take a binary divide, some extreme saying Africa is going nowhere, it is a hopeless continent, and therefore others taking a utopian view that Africa is going to have this smooth ride into greatness because of its demographic dividends. And those two extremes do not begin to answer or address the complexities that Africa and the African countries have to deal with, the dilemmas that they have to deal with, yet again, when these major powers are emerging and each one having its own conditionalities. America, on the other side, tend to emphasize on AGOA, which is a trade platform or preferential trade agreement, but also they will have a number of your, maybe let me just mention this other initiative by the US, which is your PEPFAR, or the health funding, and the several NGOs, such as the USAID, which tend to come in to assist in targeted programs. But that at times become a challenge because at times it has political conditions, and those political conditions tend to be resisted or resented by some of the countries. Whilst it is understandable that the issue of human rights could be the condition for assistance because of the values of human rights are very important, but the inconsistent application of these, for example, you'll find that the US and Europe will say these are human rights conditions for African countries before they get aid or before they have this kind of trade agreement. But when they come to other regions that they see as their allies or strategic allies in the Middle East or elsewhere, you don't see consistent application of these conditions, and that in itself tend to create some challenges. Of course, on the other side, you do have China, which has come with its Road and Belt Initiative, which mainly put in the infrastructure. And their approach, they say, we put no conditions, and as such, we build the infrastructure even within and between African countries, which is what Africans have been calling for, so that they can boost their industrial base and internal trade. But of course, the critics have said China, even though not stated, comes with their programs, and it could be a debt trap again. And that in itself is fiercely debated precisely because some countries are fearful of finding themselves trapped in a debt situation that they cannot get out of. So that in itself has been the approach from China. Of course, China has creatively used the BRICS Forum, which include your Brazil, India, and South Africa, as well as Russia, as one of the platforms. Hence, now you have the BRICS Development Bank. That in itself is still at its fledgling stage, but we will have to watch and see. In the recent BRICS conference, which was hosted by South Africa, and I participated in a number of those sessions, the issue of reducing the dependence on dollar, the American dollar as a reserve currency, has come up quite sharply. And again, the reason for that for some of the countries is the weaponization of the currency itself when countries do not toe a particular political line. But here lies a dilemma. When you do have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whatever justification they might present, which is against your international law, the African countries, many, have just responded by not even participating in that space or just being immune to whatever was taking place there, because they raised this issue to say when there are wars in different parts of the world, you do not have a similar response, a similar bombardment to pay focus on those and the resources that are pumped into those, hence the indifference. Not because they do not see the catastrophe and the pain and the suffering that is there, but again, their insistence on consistency is the one thing that they are raising again and again. Hence, it has become yet a tussle. Let me quickly talk to the African Agency as to what Africa has been trying to do on its own and how inadequate that has been at times. The first one, Africa has tried to come up with various initiatives. When President Mbeki came up with the African Renaissance program, which was well supported by some of the regional powers, such as your Nigeria under Obasanjo, Bouteflika in Algeria, Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia. So those regional powers were able to drive this program. And out of it, the African Union was created. NEPAD, which was more focused on the economic development program, came up. The African peer review mechanism, which was meant to be a peer review system in the promotion of good governance and democracy. Those are some of the initiatives that Africa on its own created. And not many other continents do come up with such programs. Of course, we can debate the fact that not many countries participate, especially in your peer review. We had a meeting recently, and you find that the uptake and the countries participating is rather few. But it's a great initiative which shows initiative and agency on the part of Africa. Of course, the Free Continental Trade Agreement, as well as the emphasis on beneficiation and the industrialization, stimulus for the continent. And that could be possible if the infrastructure to connect Africa with Africa and with African countries, instead of the original infrastructure, which was built from pit to port, it was meant for the export rather than the internal trade. So that in itself has been one of those initiatives, which when Africa goes to BRICS, when it goes to some of these other summits with the US, with Europe, they come up with this basket to say it is within the context of this initiative. That in itself incrementally is beginning to yield some results because you have a continental approach. Of course, with the Belt and Road Initiative of President Xi of China, this has been used effectively to try and inject some funding as well as some building of infrastructure within the continent itself. And that has not been adequate. And of course, as I said, it has its own conditions. Africa's approach to the reforms in the UN and Africa's approach to the reforms in the World Trade Organization and the Bretton Woods institutions, especially after realizing that post-COVID, the effort to rebuild these institutions lending, especially to your Western countries, had more favorable conditions than they have been on the continent, which has been on a debt trap. But what I observed in the literature is that the time when Africa has been able to consolidate its one voice, it's when leaders, especially from regional powers, have worked together and have had chemistry, as was the case between Mbeki, Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, and Obasanjo of Nigeria and Bouteflika in Algeria. That chemistry has not been forthcoming at this stage. You find that President Kagame of Rwanda is a very strong leader. He has an impact, but his country is small, and he tends to have more of a nationalistic approach than a continental approach. So that fragmentation, the same with South Africa, the same with other regions. Of course, the other factor is that these countries are dealing with their own internal challenges and internal political dynamics that tend to restrict leaders from those grand vision focus that we saw during the times of Kwame Nkrumah, during the times of Haile Selassie, Abdel Nasser, and so forth. The other challenge to the African Agency, again, comes in with the Middle Eastern conflict now at a boiling point. It means many of the countries in the Arab North or north of Sahara tend to be drawn into the Middle Eastern conflict, more so for Egypt, because that is happening within its own vicinity. It has an existential and immediate security concern to Egypt. So that tend to suck their energy and tend to refocus them there. I would have spoken with more time to the internal wars which are taking place, the civil strife or the rebels within countries from Mozambique to Niger to Mali and so forth. Those two have a way of taking focus from those countries into their own security concerns, but it often plays into the space of the major players who tend to exploit this particular internal fragmentation and weakness, as you see in Sudan now. So this in itself, even where you have Agenda 2063, where you have very clearly outlined the vision, it doesn't go far. One, because of these internal weaknesses, because of the leadership crisis where they can't coordinate their actions, but also largely because of the external forces which create contestations. So that in itself, I do think that Africa at this stage faces these challenges, and if it does not attend to its own internal development in a coordinated fashion, what we have been talking to as the demographic dividend could become a demographic curse. The same way areas with resources like DRC and several others have seen wars where what ought to have been giving dividends becomes a curse. Internal weaknesses have a way of inviting some of these challenges. Of course, issues of Morocco and the Western Sahara or Sahara, region, issues of Israel and Palestine do have an impact on Africa itself, as you saw the disagreement between South Africa and other countries and the chairperson of the AU when he invited Israel to have an observer status, something that was later reversed. And again, these are not taking place in a vacuum. There is a contestation that has a way of inflicting African countries when they're trying to coordinate their own, programs. So I want to conclude by saying Africa, for it to reclaim the space and to be a key role player, will have to play the space between the West, where many still have embedded trade agreement, cultural agreements, and the emerging China and other regional powers, but play this creatively the same way India has been able to be within BRICS and still attend to the West, and the same way Turkey is able to play both the West and the East to its advantage, emphasizing its own national interests. But in this case, it would have to be its own continental agenda and interest. The second one, I do think that Africa has to lead the charge and have a clearer agenda in terms of the reform of international and multilateral institutions, especially those that have a bearing on its own development agenda, just like your development finance agencies, as well as the World Trade Organization, focusing on some of the trends and the issues which are emerging, such as your pandemic, the energy crisis, and all those. It should not just be a matter of reforming these institutions, but Africa has to push harder on those areas which have the greatest impact on Africa. And the issue of rapid technological innovations. There, Africa has an opportunity, if it was bargaining, not as individual 54 countries, but as a continent, to have a stake on some of the programs which could make it cheaper to have connectivity, which could have cheaper to have access to satellite connectivity as well. Companies such as your Elon Musk, Starlink, and many others, or even bypassing the current arrangements. That in itself, it can use to leapfrog its own development by embarking on some of these technological innovations. Similarly, on the issue of just transition, I do think that if Africa was speaking as a bloc and it was able to articulate its own demands and demand consistency even on the other powers in the West and in the East, which are now having to reduce their emissions on their own terms, whereas some African regions do have a gun on their head to reduce their emissions without any cushion in terms of the damages which it could cause. But again, I want to say that the changing system is leading us away from a unipolar arrangement. Africa ought to learn lessons from what happened during the Cold War and be able to play as a bloc, not as fragmented individual countries. And as a bloc, it will have a greater voice on the reforms and place itself right at the center of the agenda. Thank you.
Very much, Professor Fikeni, for I think you laid it very, very clearly. And it's time for question and answers. You can raise your hand or you can type your question in the Q&A section. And I can see that Jim has raised their hand. You can unmute and ask your question. Jim Pinjan, you can unmute now and ask your question. Jim, did you mean to ask a question? Okay, I don't know what's happening there. So if anybody have a question or a comment, you feel free to raise your hand or type your question. And for me, I think the key thing, and you kept saying it, it's imperative for Africa to unite. But the question is how? What needs to be done? And in that sense, maybe what's the role of the intellectuals for that unity? We most of us, I think, recognize this need. This is needed. This is what it will take. But how?
Well, I do think that the first thing that we ought to do is to learn from the previous arrangement of continental initiatives. When OAU was formed, it was largely the heads of states, the governments, which were key players. In the 21st century, you do have many other players on the stage, whether in business, private sector, or in the intellectual space. If we begin to recognize the power of linking people in order to drive the agenda in any space where we are, then we'll begin to have a greater impact than just heads of states or governments. And this will also have to be creative about the issue of the African diaspora, both the first generation diaspora, those who left in a form of slavery, who are now placed after many generations in Europe, in the Americas, South and North. How do we link up with them? And the second wave generation of those who left since independence to settle in the other countries, because other countries like India have used creatively the issue of the diaspora, including the remittances of the diaspora, creating an infrastructure for that. And they have linked some of the CEOs who are in the diaspora with the programs in their own country or regions. So it would be the same approach where we begin to recognize a list of scientists in particular areas, if it's AI, for example, and begin to have a database and create a forum for them. That would then be able to give that group power to approach and influence the African Union. Because right now, as I indicated, political leadership remains deeply fragmented. Yes, we see some emerging efforts out of existential pressures for them to work together, but the fragmentation and the obsession with internal country issues has been the one that is limiting them.
Thank you very much. And I don't want to be the only one asking questions here, so feel free to raise your hand or type your questions. And while we wait for others, another thing I was wondering, maybe you can comment on. I know many Africans have hope in this new polarized world, and mainly the role of South Africa in the BRICS. So I was just wondering if you have any comments, what role can South Africa play? Because another question is, isn't it the role of the traditional institutions, international institutions? They don't seem to have been very helpful to Africans. And in relation to that, like, what hopes or how Africans should play this new institution that are the BRICS to help them?
Thank you very much for that question. I just want to start by saying South Africa has already played a role to say each time there is a BRICS conference, even if not hosted by South Africa, it has always been arguing for Africa to have a say and to have an African delegation. Similarly, in the G20, it has always argued that there should be a continental agenda as much as South Africa has its own national interest as well. So to that extent, the expansion of BRICS to include Ethiopia and, to include several other countries with the aim of further expanding it. And the BRICS Development Bank also being placed here and African countries being able to access it, I guess they can play a smart game of bargaining for reforms in the IMF, the World Bank, and other lending institutions. by saying that if you do not, we will then be drifting towards these other alternative markets. And that in itself, I do think that it's a smart game that Africa, but having a continental position, can play. Similarly, with the reduction of dependence on the dollar as a reserve, it's another bargaining tool where you begin to have several options, but you bargain with the countries instead of abandoning the countries that you have had traditional relationships with. But I still emphasize people-to-people relationship. As we're discussing in BRICS, we were beginning to look at how institutions linking universities, linking business sector, linking students, linking different other, that in itself is very important because it sustains relationships beyond just political leaders coming around the table.
Makes sense. Thank you. We have some questions. You can read them, or if you want me to read them to you. So one from...
The one which says the issue of reparation of slavery and colonialism has been raised by many on the continent and in its diaspora. Does African continent have a moral, political, and philosophical conviction strong enough to achieve a resolution on this matter? I do think that if we speak with one voice, whether it's a Mau Mau issue in Kenya, or it's a slavery issue in general, or many other things like Belgium in Congo, that in itself needs to be on the agenda. But of course, reparations can be negotiated in different forms. If they say the formula for reparation, because slavery took place long time ago, you could then be demanding certain infrastructure built. You could be demanding certain concessions in the patency and the other things such as your drugs and many other things. It all takes a united, consistent, effort for this to be attended to. So that I saw the other questions running away, but why do as Africans continue playing to the gallery of the scramble? Who is benefiting from it? Obviously, it's not the majority of Africans who are benefiting from it. It's when you do have the proxies, it's the major powers that tend to make the scramble for Africa. This time around, Africa would be most vulnerable precisely because if the West and the US are in a contestation and Russia, China on the other side are in a contestation, then you will have Africa as the one continent that is seen as having resources and the reserves of those resources when they are constrained, like the supply of Russian oil and gas, which was supplied to many Western European countries like Germany at a discounted prices, at times even 40%. Once those are removed, they'll start looking for the market. But if they come to Africa and find Africa not organized, again, Africa becomes the victim of that scramble. That scramble becomes possible when the political elite or business elite see that they can benefit as being conduits of some of these external forces rather than pushing the continental agenda. And that is the challenge. And I will check now. I think I've answered those. Why scramble for Africa even today? It is actually more desperate today, precisely because if the West doesn't control access the resources in Africa, it's going to decline faster. If China, Russia, and others do not access these resources in Africa, their claim to resist the West and ascendance as an alternative bloc is going to be severely constrained. remember that even the sanctions being imposed on China, China will start looking for newer markets, and that is why it is key to have Africa well organized and its leaders. When I talk of leaders, I don't talk just of political leaders. I talk of business, I talk of scholars or intellectuals, I talk of people in the tech industry, should have strategic foresight and should have a Pan-African instinct on how to make these spaces and the networks work. Of course, the Alumni Association of MSU, the African Alumni Association, is beginning to do just that, networking people, putting them together, creating database in their spheres of influence or expertise. That can be upscaled.
So we have a question about your view about Agenda 2063. Is it going to take Africa anywhere, or is it just a stock show?
Well, any framework or vision is as good as its members' commitment. It is as good as its potential beneficiaries making it real. There's nothing that says Agenda 2063 should be a presidential or a country project. Everything that is talked about there, peace and security and several others, each one of us from where we stand, we could work towards promoting those. Some people from the continent are working in the international agencies, which are quite influential. Some are working in scientific agencies, universities, research institutions, policy institutions. If they have that Pan-African orientation, they would use that to their advantage. The reason you find Israel being such a small country with such a disproportionate influence, it has been able to use its cultural diplomacy. India is beginning to do just that. France has been able to do that using its cultural diplomacy to bring in and network people. China has been quite deliberate in doing that, as it was sending its students or linking up with Chinese abroad wherever they are. We will need to have that kind of sophistication, consistency, and focus, especially your strategic foresight.
Thank you. There is one question in the chat.
It says, thank you for the enlightening talk, Prof. I want to ask, how do we make leaders better account to their population so they speak in a united voice on behalf of ordinary Africans? Yep, that is a complex issue, but it is not an impossible. First, if we were to make sure that democracies in our countries do work, and we build institutions of governance, and we make sure that those reforms lead to professionalization of public service, where people are appointed not because of their tribal affiliation, not because of their religious affiliation, but because they are competent and they do know what they are doing. That has to start within the countries, but countries have to work together to assist each other in that particular process. It is only when you have this accountability and institutional arrangements that leaders can be held accountable. However, if these are lacking or they are weak, you are less likely going to hold leaders accountable. But also, people must have agency. There's nothing that stops people who are capable from participating in the political life of a country. It cannot be that people who go into politics are people who are not equipped or are former soldiers or are people who simply could not make it in the professional world, could not make it in the business world, and therefore they see this as one opportunity for social mobility, which has the lowest threshold. So it is us, when we begin to say it begins with me, because we might be the leaders we've been waiting for. Only thing is our modesty and our thinking that our impact will be limited. And it is for that reason that Mother Teresa was asked, you are only focusing on few communities around Calcutta. Is this not a drop in an ocean? And her answer was, without those drops, the ocean would be less. If we begin to appreciate the cumulative effect of what we could do. Let me give you one example. Whilst visiting professor at UNISA and also working in that institution, we started an entity which was management of democratic elections in Africa. We raised funds, some we got them from USAID, from Flemish, from Japanese, and so on. There we were able to bring in election management officials from 34 African countries, train them. For 5 successive years, we were doing that program. And that program led to some reforms. I remember being in Zanzibar and visiting other countries which said, out of this program, we were able to spot some weaknesses in our electoral laws. And therefore, we are embarking on reforms. So we're able to impact even though we were just a university. We partnered with the South African Independent Electoral Commission. We partnered with other institutions. And most of these lessons were not just coming from the South African example. Countries were able to bring people to share their own experiences. And countries were able to say, I think the Gambian experience, I think the Tunisian experience will suit better my situation. And that is what we ought to be doing. And that is what I think Michigan State University, having one of the biggest African studies program, ought to be looking at those high impact catalytic projects. And it should be daring and ambitious to say, we will partner with the AU, we will partner with the African peer review mechanism, and some of those people who are heading those institutions are our colleagues that we've worked with. We would be able to link them up so that we are able not just to develop human resources by training one graduate at a time, but begin to say, how do we impact the world in a positive manner that will have a lasting legacy?
Well, we'll continue to work on that as an African Studies Center, find ways to collaborate with people like yourself. And we appreciate, as my colleague, Dr. Chuti said, we really appreciate your commitment, the time you were putting into the alumni network and all the work you are doing. We appreciate you coming today. We know you're very busy, but coming and sharing with us today, we appreciate that. And we thank you for your time with the Alumni Network and for coming today and sharing. And we thank also the audience for coming today and for listening and asking questions. We'll see you next time. Thank you very, very much. I don't know if you have a final, anything else you want to say before we leave.
Well, all what I would say is that people like Kwame Nkrumah were students. They met fellow students. They were a cohort of leaders who were able to think, reimagine the African continent. People who were in slavery, they were doing the same. And it is upon us to say, in this third decade moving forward of the 21st century, what networks, especially when it is now easy in the Internet of Things to have connectivity, what can we do in a creative manner that will impact and have an intergenerational impact going forward, especially for the continent, using the diaspora in a creative manner, because most of the time we've been wrestling as a continent without lifting our gaze, utilizing the diaspora into some of these multilateral organizations so that we begin to access those things that we are able to access in the advanced democracies or countries or economies, and utilize them to the benefit of the continent. So I just want to say, we are the leaders we've been waiting for. We shouldn't look for any magic from any head of state. Some of them are more worried about the next election rather than the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very well said. Thank you, everybody.